let me just start by introducing the panelists, and then I'm going to say a couple things by way of a kind of a prologue to getting things going. Offer my own perspective on some of these issues, and then we will just kind of have each of the panelists, and I think we'll just go in kind of alphabetical order, but we'll have each of the panelists say, make a brief statement for a few minutes. I'll moderate some discussion or some Q&A among the panelists, depending on how they are so inclined. And then we'll open it up to you all to raise questions that may pertain to some of the issues the panelists raised, or some of the issues that we saw on the webcast, or anything else. So the first panelist is Professor Walid Abdelhadi, Professor of Geography, and also Director of the, and I always have to read this because I always want to say center instead of, Director of CERES, which is the Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences, also a former chief scientist at NASA. I also invited Terry Fees, who's the Vice Chancellor for Research and Innovation, to serve on the panel. She was unfortunately at the last minute unable to join us because of illness, and so first of all, our thoughts go out to Terry. We hope she is feeling better. Walid is going to represent some of Terry's thoughts on this issue as well. So Walid will be followed by Jimmy Ilson, who is Director of International Programs here at the University of Colorado Law School. And then Diana Salazar, who is the Director of International Student and Scholar Services here at CU Boulder. And then Tim Weston, Associate Professor of History and former Associate Director at the Center for Asian Studies here. And then finally, Professor Emily Ye of the Geography Department. Three of us are academics whose careers are based on research in China, and three of us have professional capacities that relate to the U.S.-China relationship here on the CU Boulder campus in other ways as well. So we hope to be able to present something of a broad spectrum of views. Just to kind of get things going, I just wanted to draw our attention to something that I thought was interesting that Professor Huang had said during the national webcast, where he raised these two issues of convergence and engagement as the basis of a lot of the U.S.-China relationship as it has gone up until recently, at least. And he mentioned that, on the China side, there seems to have been a giving up on the idea of convergence, where China's interest and U.S. interests would eventually converge, and that on the U.S. side, we've given up on the idea of engagement. And I wanted to pick up on that idea a little bit, because as we've seen here on this campus and on other university campuses and in other research centers around the country, we've seen this result in a distinct shift from a relationship of largely based on collaboration between U.S. and China researchers, U.S. and China students, U.S. and China academics, to one of some degree of suspicion regarding both researchers and students from China or of Chinese descent even, on U.S. university campuses and university and college campuses. And some of that suspicion has come directly from, for example, statements made by FBI Director Christopher Wray in statements before Congress, where he said, now we have to think about China as a whole of society threat to U.S. national security interests, and that the U.S.-China relationship is undermined or threatened by what he called non-traditional collectors of intelligence, meaning students and professors and researchers. My reaction to that kind of a statement has always been to and one of my inspirations for holding this event, and one of the things I kind of put to our panelists was my own perspective, was a kind of a plea for the university to remain a space of engagement in a world where we see fewer and fewer of those spaces of engagement actually occurring in terms of our commercial trade relationship, in terms of our security relationship between U.S. and China, and a belief that the university still seems to have that there still could be a role for the university as providing that kind of a space for engagement. And so my comments focus on this issue. We didn't see a lot of discussion on the national webcast on the role of the university, on the role of higher education, on the nature of education in different aspects of this U.S.-China relationship. We heard a lot of other perspectives and statements regarding policy, regarding trade, regarding tariffs, and these kinds of things. But the specific role of the university, I think, is one that we locally here can take up and can say some things about. As a China researcher, as somebody who does a lot of work in China, who works with Chinese collaborators on a regular basis, I have been. It has been really interesting to me to witness kind of the ironies of the some of the ways that we find constraints on the role of engagement of the U.S. university and the U.S.-China relationship repeated on the China side as well. That there is also increasing constraint within China, an increasingly constrained environment for research and education and educational collaboration between China and the U.S. A lot of the people I've worked with over the years have expressed to me their own frustration at that increasing constraint that comes not simply at the behest of deteriorating U.S.-China relationships, but at the changing nature of governance within China itself as well. 10 years ago, everyone, that is U.S. universities, was clamoring for kind of a piece of China, right? Everyone was opening China campuses and wanting to be as engaged in China as possible. And now we are at a very different situation where China is being viewed as a principal strategic threat or threat to U.S. national security. So how did this happen? How did we get to this point? And one of the ways the question is typically framed is between the ideas of security on the one hand versus openness on the other. And of course, this is how a lot of things have been framed in the U.S. since 9/11 in many respects. And the question I would want to kind of put out there, I guess, is there an alternative way to frame this question that dominates a lot of how we think about the U.S.-China relationship as one between on U.S. campuses, as one between security and openness? Is there a way to think about this in a different way? So, a general question that I put to the panelists, as well as some other things to think about, was, what is the role of the U.S. research university in the U.S.-China relationship? And so I'll let our panelists pick up from that, and they might address that directly or address other related issues that come up with that. But we'll start with Walid.
Okay, thank you. So I'm director of a research institute here on campus, and I also had a conversation with a very ill Terry Fees, vice chancellor for research. So most of my remarks are going to be my own. Well, they'll all be my own, but I'm going to bring in a little bit of what she and I talked about as well. But if anything sounds off or disturbs you, that's me. That's not her. So I wanted to talk about there were two things that really stood out in my mind. One was the comment about the Sputnik moment and the Chinese capabilities in China with regard to artificial intelligence, sustainable energy, and material science were the examples that were used. And the other is our ability to conduct research in this country and the impediments associated with the restrictions associated with Chinese students, researchers, scholars, etc. So first to the Sputnik moment. Sputnik was a time when the Soviet Union was regarded as a tremendous threat to the U.S. security interests, U.S. national interests. And the fact that we appeared to be losing the space race was a distilling moment. You could see it. There was a launch, there was a satellite, it beeped in space, which I always thought was weird because sound doesn't travel in space. But it sent signals of a beep back to the ground. But it was a moment. It was crystal clear. What's happening with the advances that are going on in China and throughout Asia is a little more subtle. It's creeping up. There's not a rocket launch and a satellite in space where a nation stands back and says, "Oh my gosh, we're in great danger here. We're at grave risk." Rather, the progression in these areas that benefit the world, that we should be investing in and moving forward as rapidly, are happening, I won't say under the radar, but they're not as in your face as Sputnik was. So I think that's one thing to consider as we consider our own U.S. investment in research. The second is tied to that Sputnik comment. Our ability to do research depends on capitalizing on all the capabilities that are out there. Domestic, foreign, there's some incredible talent that, during World War II or prior to the lead up to World War II, we drew from the capabilities of German rocket scientists, German engineers, I won't call them bomb makers, but ultimately that's where we ended up. And I think, I don't want to draw parallels, except in the sense that entities that may appear adversarial, and I'll use that in quotes, also have a lot of talent, a lot to offer, or have a lot of good-willed people that are trying to do good things and bring those capabilities forward for constructive and peaceful purposes. I think Tim had mentioned the statement by Director Wray of the FBI, and I think in principle, the threats that exist from China, the espionage that does happen in federal facilities, that does happen in industry, that the intellectual espionage that does happen on university campuses, I do agree that those are concerns, and those are concerns that need to be paid attention to. But at the same time, I think the approach is taken to extreme. Whenever national security interest is going up against the good of the people interest, national security interest always wins. It can't be compromised. And so there's sort of an approach that is, well, it's kind of like the innocent till proven guilty. It's more like guilty till proven innocent. The approach is we'd rather mistakenly accuse or suspect 10 people incorrectly than let one person slip through the cracks. And so that's why we are today. And I think the universities really are a space for engagement, a space for bringing together the best of all worlds, of both sides, if you will. I don't like the use of the word sides, but I think it's probably appropriate. And so ultimately, I think it is in our own national interest, both from a security perspective and an economic and health and social perspective, to invest in research, to be competitive, to take advantage of the intellect and the resources that do exist from researchers, students, others who want to work with us in the university environment. I believe in vetting, not targeting. I think there are very real risks, and there are real risks that I think a lot of people in this room simply are not in a position to be aware of. But there are very real risks. And I think to the extent that we can, without violating security protocols, people need to be educated about the risks and the roles they can play in mitigating or minimizing those risks. As I said, ultimately, national security interest will take priority. I agree that competitiveness and engagement, when done carefully and thoughtfully, will directly serve U.S. security interests as well as other interests, economic, social, and otherwise. So that's my take. Bottom line is there are risks, there are challenges, but it really is in our interest to manage those in a way that is not extreme or over the top. I don't know who's next, because I don't know everybody's name, but if there's a
Wally.
B in the room, please speak.
Yeah, thanks, Wally. Yeah, Jimmy.
Just to share a little bit about what I do. I'm a director of international programs at the law school. What I actually do is I run what's called an LLM degree, or a Master of Laws degree. It's in the U.S. It's probably not common. Most Americans in the room probably haven't heard of it. It's the second degree in law. It's a specialized degree in law. Most of the world, their first degree isn't actually a JD or a postgraduate or a graduate level degree. It's an LLB, or a bachelor degree in law. And so most of the world goes on to pursue a graduate level degree or an LLM and specialize in a certain area of law. Again, not very common in the U.S., very common outside of the U.S. And I just ran the numbers, I checked them again, and currently LLM enrollment in the United States across the board is roughly 30% Chinese students. And so when you talk about engagement across the board on the university and the legal ramifications, China is investing very heavily in familiarizing themselves with common law, with U.S. law, and with the U.S. approach to international law. And unfortunately, it's when we talk about engagement, it's very one-sided. You see, I think, roughly 1,600 to 1,700 Chinese students or attorneys, practicing attorneys, coming to the U.S. and studying our legal systems, studying our approach to international law, and then taking that back to China, whereas in the U.S., I would say there's roughly maybe a handful of Americans that go to China and actually study Chinese civil law and the Chinese approach to international law. Oftentimes, more often than not, many of these Chinese attorneys can qualify to sit a U.S. State Bar exam, so they can represent Chinese interests in U.S. courts. They're familiarizing themselves with our intellectual property laws, practices, and in turn, they're bringing that back to China. This has been going on for about 20 or 30 years. So what you have now are a number of legal practitioners in China who are acutely familiar with the U.S. legal system, and again, our approach to international law. When we talk about engagement on the research level, I mean, I've loved all the Chinese students I work with. They're all fantastic. I think law's a bit different and doesn't necessarily have the actual technical, like specific implications
property,
in regards to intellectual property and state security interests. But the law is kind of the undergirding principles that protect those items. And you know, I think in terms of engagement, you know, honestly, the majority of LLM programs in the U.S. wouldn't exist if it weren't for Chinese students. I would say, coming from UT Austin, my program was roughly 50% Chinese students. So they really funded the program. And in a lot of ways, they also help us to fund our JD programs as well. Those revenue fees are significant. All that being said, when we talk about engagement within a U.S. research university, I think it's been fairly productive. On the U.S. side of things, I think the biggest disappointment is that generally there's not an investment in familiarizing ourselves with the legal systems of the world, China included, and the various approaches and perspectives on international law that are unfortunately not as relevant as some people would prefer them to be here in the U.S. So yeah, I would love to see more engagement, more reciprocal engagement within the area of legal education. I would love to see more Americans going abroad to diversify their perspectives on legal systems of the world, and more specifically China. And I was really kind of struck by, I'll close by saying I was struck by the end of the conversation at the town hall, where they talked about how they actually felt like the U.S. approach was working, and that's why there was kind of a drawback on the Chinese side of things. You know, Chinese students aren't just coming here to study international business law, U.S. business law. They're also taking courses in indigenous peoples law or ethnic minority law, human rights, and whatnot. So I think there has been, on the social side of things, a really positive effect. The Chinese attorneys and students coming to the U.S. And I agreed with that take on things, that it was having an impact. Unfortunately, there's not enough domestic students that are familiarizing themselves with, again, Chinese law, Chinese culture, and the Chinese approach to international law and politics.
Thanks, Jim.
Yeah.
Diana?
Yes, I thought it'd be probably most helpful to share with you all is the numbers that we see here of international students and scholars. Our office is International Student and Scholar Services, and what that means is we serve not only international undergrad and graduate students, but also scholars. And scholars could be anything from tenure track faculty members to lecturers to postdoctoral researchers to someone coming to put on a performance. It could be a short-term visitor. So it's a very broad category that we clump together as scholars. To give you an idea of the impact of our Chinese international students and scholars on this campus, our total number of international students is approximately 3,000. Our total number of scholars, if you look over a period of a year, is about 800. But we have a lot of movement, so about 200 to 300 international scholars come and go during the year. But to give you the idea of the impact of the Chinese population, we currently have approximately 1,100 Chinese students on campus, of which the undergrad population is about 800 and the graduate is about 270. And then we have about 40 non-degree students, which means most of those are in an intensive English program here on campus. And how that breaks down to, well, what are they studying? Well, there's about 650 of those international students are in arts and sciences, and the next major college is the College of Business with about 100. As far as the majors, the economics is the top major currently, and then physics, and then mathematics. So a lot of the STEM fields are towards the top. Now, as far as our international scholars, we don't have as much data on what fields they're studying just because we don't track it except when we have to. We tend to, for reasons that unless we need to track certain data, we're just not going to be tracking it. But to give you an idea, for this one type of visa, which is called the exchange visitor visa, and that means somebody who's intending to come here and then return home. That's the mission of the exchange visitor program. So if you look at exchange visitors right now and currently on campus, we have 130 out of a total of 172 Chinese scholars. Of those 130, we have 27 in physics, 15 in mechanical engineering, and then it just breaks down from there. So you can see that the impact on campus of our Chinese population is huge. Our role in our office is we advocate for all of our international students and scholars, and we also facilitate them being able to come into this country. Has it become more difficult overall in the last few years? Yes. But are Chinese students and scholars still coming? Yes. So there may be more loops, as I say, that we have to jump through, but they are still able to come and having a great impact on this campus. And so really in our role, we have to do certain activities or monitor certain things because of a compliance role, but at the same time, we serve as advocates. So it's a delicate balance that we have, but we do it well, I think, because we also try to be, I should emphasize, we try to be a source of information, because things are changing quickly in the immigration world, as you know. So one of our goals for our team is to always be communicating and clearly expressing the information so that we can answer the questions that our international students and scholars may have. So I think I'll leave it there so that there's time for questions.
Thanks, Dan.
Sure.
Okay. Thanks again to everybody for coming. My comments are based primarily on my personal experience as somebody who teaches a lot of Chinese students and teaches about modern China. And I just want to say from the outset that I strongly believe that universities have a very important role to play in Sino-American relations. I think it's a critical area. I would say not only research universities like our own, but also community colleges, liberal arts colleges, higher education in general, but even now these days secondary schools. It's proliferating. And while, of course, there are inevitably tensions that Walid talked about and that we heard about also in the town hall, And I would say most of those tensions are at the research university level, and I think most of those tensions are in the STEM disciplines that were just talked about. That's not my area. I'm in the humanities. I teach in the Department of History, and my area of expertise is modern Chinese history. And I think there we're dealing with a very different set of questions. And there I would say that the teaching component to undergraduates in particular, I do have Chinese graduate students, but they're not large in number, and that's not where the majority of my teaching is focused. I think teaching undergraduates is exceedingly important. And I would like to say that a year ago, I think I last taught my Intro to Modern Chinese History class, the lowest division course, lowest level course I teach. Somewhere in the neighborhood of 75 students in that class. About 60 were Chinese nationals. So I was teaching a class overwhelmingly to Chinese students. And what was I teaching them? I was teaching modern Chinese history to Chinese students, which, you know, if I went back 10 years ago, same number of students, a different, in the same class, I would say there were maybe half a dozen Chinese students in my class. It's completely transformed in the last 6 or 7 years as CU Boulder has tried to get on the gravy train that is Chinese student tuition fees. I see it as very positive, though, for a lot of reasons. And one of those reasons has to do with the American student experience. When you are an American student and you are a distinct minority in a classroom in your own country, I think that's a positive thing. I think it's a good thing to realize that there are other parts of the world where people have views of the world that are quite different and distinct from your own. Two, I think it's very important for them to hear from, it goes along with the same point, but to hear perspectives from non-Americans, especially about the subject matter that we're talking about in the class, Chinese people commenting on Chinese history. And hopefully they'll also get a chance to just know one another and become friends. Why do Chinese students take my class? I've often asked myself that question, and I think the primary reason, I hate to say it, is because they think they're going to do pretty well in it, because it's modern Chinese history, and they think, well, they're Chinese and they probably can do well. Unfortunately, that's not always true, but it's sometimes true. But I'd like to think it's also because they're genuinely interested in what an American has to say about their country's history. They will find out very quickly that I'm someone who loves China, that cares a great deal about China's future, who speaks Chinese and who goes to China as often as I can possibly go. And I think that sort of puts me in a good position with them very quickly. I think they want a different perspective on Chinese history. I think most students who come to this country are well aware that they get a particular kind of propagandistic view of Chinese history. I don't want to slam it totally, but what you get in the high school level is pretty superficial and pretty much serves the interests of the Communist Party. I talk about subject matter that you're not going to hear about in China. I talk about the Great Leap Forward. I talk about the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. I talk about the massive demonstrations of 1989 and the massacre that ended them. I talk about the history behind the Taiwan independence issue. I talk about controversies in Tibet and in Xinjiang, etc. And actually, I find my Chinese students are most interested at that time. Those are the subjects that they're not going to get in China. Those are the subjects I think they may not disagree with. They may not agree with me. They may disagree with me, but they still want to hear that other point of view. I think they want to hear it from somebody who they know actually. It starts from the position of caring about and liking China. I've never, and I keep waiting for this to happen, I've never received pushback. I don't know if any of you others have, but I've never received pushback from a Chinese student on subject matter that I know is very sensitive in China. I'm waiting for it to happen. Maybe I'm just so intimidating that they don't want to say anything, but I don't think so. I also want to say that I spent 2 years as a foreign student in China, 1 year in Taiwan. It changed my life fundamentally. I got to know, my teachers were Chinese, I learned Chinese, my friends were Chinese, a lot of my classmates were Chinese. My view of all this is not only as somebody who teaches Chinese students, but as somebody who was a foreign student in China, and that was transformative, as I just said, of my life. And while a lot of things about China were not always and this is way back when, were not necessarily always comfortable or easy. Nevertheless, I found them always rich and exciting and challenging to me as to what it means to be an American in this world, and I appreciate that. I think that's important. Let's see here. I go to China annually, and typically I go there in the context of an academic. And that means either to be a visiting scholar, to go to a conference, to teach classes in China, either to Americans or to Chinese people. My whole context in China is as an academic. I don't make money in China, although maybe someday that would be a nice thing to do. What I therefore do is I deal with people who are not the power elite. I deal with people who are much like students at CU or elsewhere, and that's a very interesting level at which to interact with China. I think it's a very different level than what we hear about in this forum that we just viewed. I think when we read the newspapers, we read about things happening at the very upper levels. Talking with students or professors or others in China who are much more like, come from the same world that I do, but in a different country, I think what I realized very quickly is that these people are also in a position where they view what's happening at these upper reaches as being far away from them. That these are not people who represent the Chinese government, who necessarily agree with the Chinese government. They will some things and not others, and it's a very delicate balance there. But that you're dealing with people on a people-to-people level. And you can have free-flowing conversations. Contrary to what I think a lot of people might think, I don't find myself censored in China at all. Now, I don't go into places where that might be the case, but I don't, and maybe we'll hear differently from Emily here. But I taught a grad seminar in Shanghai 2 summers ago to Chinese graduate students, and I was talking mostly about freedom of the press issues. And how China doesn't have a freedom of the press. I was being filmed, but that's what happens in a lot of Chinese classrooms. Nobody once came in and said, stop talking about this. Nobody once pushed back against me. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't issues. There are certainly issues, but I haven't experienced them personally. And last couple of points I'd like to make is that, well, just building on the same point, I will have engaged with Chinese students and scholars and the like. We will debate issues. It's not as though we don't, and I find that very productive and interesting, and I sometimes change my perspectives on things, to be sure. But it's friendly. It's based on the idea that we genuinely we care about each other. Sometimes these are old friends of mine, so it's really easy. Sometimes they're newer friends of mine and not so easy. But just last summer, I spent several weeks in Beijing at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, and the trade war was just heating up. And I can tell you one thing, people in China despise Donald Trump. When he was elected, that wasn't the case, as was being said here. When Trump was elected, people thought, he's a businessman. He knows how to negotiate.
You can trust them, yes.
Yeah. Now everybody is appalled. And it's not only about the way he's treating China, I might add. I would say that people in China admired American democracy. They admired the sense of rule of law. They admired the sense of concern for human rights. And what Trump has squandered, I think, is not only, it has squandered the liberal intellectual elite in China's support. And that's something I found very interesting in this past summer in particular. And we'll stop there.
Okay, Izzy.
Okay, so I also am teaching a class on contemporary China, and I was going to say some very similar things, which is that I think classroom teaching with people from China and American students is one very productive form of engagement. But since you already covered that topic, so I'll just talk a little bit more about my own experiences as well. So I have done research on environment and development in Tibetan areas of the PRC for about 2 decades, and so I am no stranger to suspicion, namely suspicion of me as an American researcher in China. So I want to start with just a few examples of some of the of my own experiences prior to the trade war and Trump, and then talk about how those have kind of escalated. And it might seem like the examples that I'm going to give of Chinese state sort of intrusions are the kinds that are mobilized by some of our politicians to argue against engagement, but I'm going to argue that it's precisely because of these that we need actually more engagement, and that we really need to work against sort of racial, ethnic, and national stereotyping. So, a few stories. One, I learned quite a few years after my dissertation was done that it had been translated without my permission, and very badly, I might add, into Chinese and made an internal document by an organ of the government under the control of the United Front. And people read the badly translated document and critique it. Another example is, I think it was around, and just to say that the suspicion has been ramped up, but it's not entirely new. I think around 2008, there was a Chinese graduate student in my department who was not working with me. She was working on something very statistical and not place-based. And she told me that the head of the Chinese Students and Scholars Association on campus had called her late one night demanding that to know all about my research on Tibet. And she told me that she told him that she didn't know, which was true, and that he should sort of buzz off. And I think that that's what happened. But so these things that we're talking about, suspicion on both sides, are not new.
You want to explain about the Chinese Student and Scholar Association, because I don't know that people in the public understand.
It is an association for Chinese students and scholars, which is largely dedicated to helping people kind of navigate the U.S. and deal with their practical problems, but it also has ties to the consulate, the embassy. I was deciding whether or not to say this. I'll just go ahead and say it. So I was working with my husband on a project at one point, and he's an American citizen of Tibetan descent, and he was detained by the State Security Bureau for 6 days without notification to anyone, including the American consulate. And I'm aware of at least one instance prior to the recent moment when someone I conducted an interview with in China was subsequently questioned. Also, just as an academic who works on Tibetan issues, I've felt strongly that sort of training Tibetan students is one way in which I can kind of give back to the community. I've had several Tibetan PhD students here. It's been a very productive collaboration. At the same time, since 2008, which is when politics sort of shifted within China, there's been this increasing suspicion within China of certain minorities having links to outside. And so former students of mine would tell me that when they returned to China, they would have extra interrogations and checks at the airports. And families of my former students have been invited for tea, namely questioned by the State Security Bureau because their children are studying in the U.S. Recently, we've been seeing a much greater level of sort of this criminalization of certain minority groups, certainly with Uyghurs, having contacts with people outside. But this, in fact, again, this is actually one reason why I think it's ever more important to be able to have students who want to come study, because it's one way in which their communities are able to maintain a sense of membership in a global community. So that's all, before Trump. What about now? So last year I was lucky to be the recipient of a Fulbright scholarship, and I spent 10 months on sabbatical in Chengdu. So given the circumstances of Tibet, I didn't propose to do anything having to do with Tibet. I proposed a project that was on transportation. But the changed circumstances of U.S.-China relations made even that very difficult. So just a couple of examples. I was invited twice by a particular university, once as a guest lecturer, once as to speak at a conference to give presentations. I provided my talks, my abstracts, my CV, everything was vetted in advance, and then both were canceled very unceremoniously shortly before I was supposed to give them, which was a lot of wasted work on my part. It seems like in those cases, someone had figured out that I was talking about Tibet, which was what I was invited to talk about, and they decided that that was not a good idea. But I think this speaks, on the one hand, to this growing sensitivity of overseas researchers, And on the other hand, to the idea that Chinese institutions and academics are not monolithic, right? People had invited me because they wanted to hear what I wanted to say. It was more surprising to me how nervous people were about sort of non-sensitive, issues that I wanted to do research on. So a really good friend of mine had gotten married between the last time I saw her, and her husband was like a safety director on highway construction. And I thought, great, like this is my in to my topic. I met him once. We had a very brief set of discussions. He pointed me to some websites. I went home and read them. I had more follow-up questions. I was thinking, aha, this is my entry to the field. I'm going to be able to do field work. And he refused to meet with me ever again, deciding basically that it was too risky. There was another incident where a cousin of a second cousin of mine was married to who I met, had a husband who designed large-scale electricity grids. And I have a student who's working on electricity. So I thought I would put them in touch through WeChat, and I tried like 4 or 5 times, and nothing ever came of it. And eventually, the distant relative told me that she thought it was too risky, so she'd never passed on the information, because her husband was recently retired from a state-owned enterprise. And again, this like idea that people having, being in important positions in state-owned enterprises should not talk to foreigners. The point of my intervention isn't just to talk about myself. These dynamics have really affected Chinese scholars. So I hosted a visiting professor here a couple of years ago who works on sacred mountains, and she went back home, and she was told, do not give a research talk about what you worked on in the U.S., which was looking at what American anthropologists have written about Nepal and kind of Himalayan culture. And again, this is part of this broader shift where, for certain communities within China, having gone even to the U.S. on a government-funded scholarship now becomes very, very difficult. And even though scholars are continuing to come, I also know that it's become much more difficult for people to come to the U.S. in particular. So, just to respond to Tim's question, I see no advantage to kind of narrowing collaborative opportunities, and I absolutely believe that the university should play a stronger role in shaping U.S.-China relations. So just last week, there was a forum in New York about, U.S.-China relations, and Steve Bannon was an expert at the table, and so surely they can find better people to perform that than,
What university is he at?
Exactly.
Many honorary degrees. All right, thanks, Emily. So we have some time to entertain your questions, but while you're kind of contemplating that, I'd just to kind of put a cap on the comments that we've had so far, or invite the panelists to follow up. I guess what I would put out there on the table is we have maybe not contradictory kind of ideas out there about engagement, but at least one in which there's 2 different kind of narratives going on. One is that engagement is in many ways over, and there's a lot of movement towards decoupling, and there's more suspicion. But on the other hand, we're hearing that ties between the U.S. and China, at least on an academic level, the academic institutions, the numbers that both Diana and Jimmy have put out, and the stories that we've heard indicate only a continuing engagement, and in many ways a deepening engagement, and in many ways a lot of things that we're seeing are a result of we might call the growing pains of engagement, the contradictions that are inevitable as that engagement continues, and that really maybe what we're seeing are the results of a lot of success in engagement, and then the question becomes, do we have the courage of our convictions in terms of continuing down that road when it really starts to get more and more difficult, right? When real problems really start to arise. I mean, we've kind of had a period of engagement where there was a lot of lofty narrative and a lot of newfound ways of cooperating, and now we're getting into the weeds of where it's really difficult and really serious questions about theft of intellectual property, suspicion, openness, and these kinds of things are really coming to the fore. And are we able to engage them at that level, or are we just going to kind of turn around and say, well, that didn't work, let's walk away? So those are the 2 narratives I hear. I wonder if if anyone would comment further on that or any of the other issues that they've heard, and then we'll turn it over to.
I have a quick
Yeah.
comment. I think part of the problem is we teach, or we treat freshman sociology students almost with the same sort of look askance as we do PhD physicists. And I think this really hit me with your comments. I think there's a spectrum of risk that does not seem to be built into the policy, or the policies as they're being enacted. And I think an awareness of that and my comments were about, US work that's vulnerable and the restrictions around that. I didn't say anything, nor do I have any experience with what happens in China at the other side of things. But I do think that an assessment of risk and a mapping of policy that takes into account that risk is a critical first step. I don't know the degree to which that's been done, but my observation suggests it hasn't been done that much. And then secondly, I think there are vetting procedures. We vet our own people when they get security clearances, to trust with national secrets. I'm not saying you need a top secret level kind of vetting, but there are, I think, basic steps that can be taken to ensure the integrity of the intellectual property is preserved. One point Terry had mentioned to me is there was a person, full-time professor in the United States, who was also a full-time employee of a company in China. And simply looking at that and saying, that's odd. Maybe we should look a little closer. There are some basic steps that
Yeah,
I think
I mean,
are
and
taken.
some of that is just basic academic integrity
Yeah,
issue,
yeah.
and not one of U.S.-China relations per se, but
Right,
one
right.
in which we would question that no matter whether that person
True,
was from China. or
true.
not.
This is a slightly different perspective, but it's kind of going off of what Jimmy said earlier, and it's something I feel strongly about, and that is, this whole question of engagement and problems in that realm, is it actually continuing, or is it receding, that Tim has just outlined. I think something to emphasize here is that the United States is, in a way, unilaterally failing, because if you think about how many Americans go to China, how many Americans study Chinese, the number just is absolutely minuscule compared with the number of Chinese who come to this country. Chinese students begin studying English very early. What grade? First grade, something like this. They all, by the time they graduate from high school, can basically read English. Some of them speak very well, but we all know what it means to study a language. Sometimes you speak well. But the point being, when I go to China, the people I encounter, they know the United States quite well. The average average Chinese college student knows far more about the United States than the average American knows about China. And I think the engagement issue is something where the United States is simply failing. And we can explain why, or think about why. There's a lot of reasons for this, but I think it's American parochialism and American fear of the other. And this, to me, is a very significant problem.